Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way.
Today we're going to be talking about the subject of domestic violence and how to treat the batterer. And we're going to be giving you an entire program of 13 weeks of how to actually do that. It's going to be based on a book called Change is the Third Path, and another book that we're using as a workbook now called Alternatives to Domestic Violence. And from that, we're going to put together a complete program to integrate all of this. And I'd like to first start out here a little bit to give you an idea of what is domestic violence. And I'm reading from Change is the Third Path. Illegally, domestic violence is the infliction or threat of infliction of any bodily injury or harmful physical contact, or the destruction of property, or the threat thereof as a method of coercion, control, revenge, or punishment upon a person with whom an actor is involved in an intimate relationship. So do you understand what that's saying? It's saying if somebody gets mad and punches their hand into the wall, is that domestic violence? Yes, it is. Why? Because that could be the person's head, couldn't it? That's a way of showing that, or throwing things, or objects, or hurting pets, or doing all sorts of other things. What we're really focusing in here is what we call a classical domestic violence perpetrator. This is the person who is so insecure and so worried about their mate possibly leaving them that they have an entire program of turning their mate into a sniveling idiot. And you're going to see as we look at some of these things of all the different issues that are involved. But this is a very serious area, and most clients that are at least of the classical type are going to have many, many different problems in areas of their life that they're going to need help with. Realize that if you have a group like this, you're going to have a whole spectrum of different people that are going to have different types of problems. Like the one particular lady who dumped a jar of mayonnaise on her husband's head. But you're going to have that all the way to very violent and dangerous people that you're going to have to deal with, and maybe even threats of violence that you're going to have to deal with in groups like this. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. In the first lesson, we're calling this assessment. The first thing is you'd be going through and helping them understand what domestic violence really is, because a lot of them just shoved her. Or if I just pushed her down, that's not domestic violence. Yes, it is. In fact, out of Change is the Third Path, we have some very good checklists, and I'm just going to spot those a little bit and give you an idea of some of the things that are on those checklists to get an idea of what might be critical and what might not be critical. And what I'm also going to do is give you an idea. I actually have one here that a particular person filled out. And I'm going to give you an idea maybe of the things that this person checked, because this was a classical domestic violence perpetrator that filled this particular thing out. And of course, I'm not giving any names or identifying anything like that, but I just want to give you an idea. Okay? First, we have the behavior checklist, and as we go down, it asks more about their family. And he checked frequent moves. Problems they've had with, he checked money. Following occurred in past relationships. He checked separation, restraining order issued, partner left without warning, and divorce. So what do we know? Is this the first relationship that he has had problems like this with? Our record is we had a man in our anger management group that had just was divorced for the 8th time. He finally reached a conclusion that maybe he had something to do with it. And we're going to find going and breaking out of denial has a lot to do with all of these kind of things. Then it asks, check all of the responses that apply to your behavior in your relationship, and he checked pushing and shoving, restraining with hands. He checked glaring at partner, blocking partner's path. Now, is that domestic violence? Yes, because it's physical. Now, realize on this checklist we have all the rest of the stuff like cutting, shooting, choking, everything else you can think of on these checklists. But the point is, that's what this particular person checked there. He also checked punching walls and doors, breaking dishes, furniture, and other household items. He has legal problems. He is separated. He's been separated more than once. He has a restraining order issued. And the current wife left without warning. Why do you think these wives are all leaving? You think this guy might be a little bit dangerous? Now, he did comment here that he had not committed any crimes, is the way he looked at it. However, is domestic violence a crime? Here's some other ones. I have used alcohol before during and after fights with my partner. That's true in about 70% to 80% of all domestic violence cases, that alcohol is involved. And this is with his wife, and he added grabbing, slapping with an open hand in the face, punching with a closed fist, controlling the partner's access to money, and name calling. Is it beginning to sound more like he's domestically violent to you? The real question, though, we need to look at now, stalking checklist. In this case, they hadn't been separated long enough. He didn't admit that he was stalking, but what is stalking? Stalking is when you're following somebody else and you're trying to get information. A lot of stalking is pumping the kids for what's going on with mom. Is mom dating again, after a divorce, or what is going on? That's all stalking. But I've had stalking enough. As an example, one of my clients, if the wife would leave the house and had to go to the bus, he would drive down the road right next to her to try and stop her from getting on the bus. Because one of the reasons he was is she was a heroin addict and she was probably going out to use. But he was trying to stop her overall, and again, that would be considered stalking. And stalking is a very usual thing here. But probably one of the ones I want you to really get a hold of here the most is the lethality checklist. And the lethality checklist comes out of the Amend book that goes along, or used to go along with Changes the Third Path. And I want to give you an idea of what are the critical things that you want to be looking for. Here are the critical things. Objectifies partner, calls for obscene names, body parts, or animals. Blames the victim for perceived injuries to self. Is unwilling to stay separated from the victim, tracks her stalking. Is obsessed with the victim, cannot function, is not eating, sleeping, or working when they're not with the victim. Is hostile, angry, furious, feels betrayed. Appears to be distraught, feels abandoned. Is in an extremely tense, volatile relationship. Is extremely jealous, blaming victim for all types of promiscuous behavior. Usually they're having affairs and everything else. What they say. Has perpetrated previous incidents of physical violence. Has killed pets. Has made threats. Has made previous suicide attempts. Is threatening suicide. Has access to the victim. Has access to guns. Abuses alcohol. Abuses amphetamines, cocaine, or crack. Has thought, desire, or intention of hurting the partner, has no desire to stop his violent and or controlling behavior. Based on how strong you agree with that, can you see those are the critical items? If you see those, you may have a duty to warn or at least discuss with the victim. Now we have another test that will help along with this, and it is called a CSR Abuse Index. And you give that one to the victim. And this one basically just rates how controlling the person has been in their life, and you get an idea pretty fast as to how controlling things are. I'll just read you a few things from the CSR. Does he continually monitor your time and make you account for every minute? Is he overly critical of daily things such as your cooking, your clothes, and your appearance? Let's go to some of the stronger ones here. Does he become angry if you don't want to go along with his request for sex? Has he ever threatened you with an object or weapon? Have you ever had to be treated for injuries from his violence with first aid? And so on. But the idea is that particular one will give you another idea, and it gives you an indication: dangerously abusive, seriously abusive, moderately abusive, and non-abusive. So if you run these two tests and they come up dangerously abusive, what are you going to do? You have to warn the victim, and you're going to have to try to work with the victim and help them have an escape plan and make sure there's some good boundaries here, because you could have a homicide in your situation. We actually had one man that we didn't have long enough to do any of this with. He'd only been seen one time, and he ended up killing his wife and his kids. So this can be very serious stuff that is going on here, that we need to be careful what we're dealing with. So anyway, in the first session, you see, we're going to try to gather that information and help them at least tell us where they are, so we know who we're working with and maybe what kind of problems, what we're going to expect. A lot of denial and a lot of minimization. Give you a fast little story. A couple I was working with, he'd been domestically violent for a long time. And that time I had all of them in counseling with me. So when anything happened in the family, I got a written report from every one of the kids, the mom and the dad. Here is the story. Tell me what you think about it. One of the dogs belonged to one of the kids, urinated on the carpet. Dad's story. He was frustrated with the dog. He went over there and hit the dog a couple times and pushed it out the door. The rest of them were standing right there. The story really was, he went over the dog, hit it with his fist 10 times as hard as he possibly could, and threw it 10 foot through the air, airborne out in the concrete. The daughter thought that the dog was probably dead. The dog did survive. Do you see the difference? To him, that is reality. Because we cover everything up, we go in denial, we minimize everything, and everyone you're going to get in this area is going to tend to be like that. The only ones that have more denial than domestic violence perpetrators are pedophiles. Drug alcohol people actually have less denial than domestic violence perpetrators. Another question we want to check is, what's the role of alcohol? Because I said 70-80% of the time alcohol is involved. And then finally, we want to talk about the group and how to use the group most effectively and so on, and there's an exercise in the workbook to do that. But that's lesson 1. By the way, usually in these groups these are 2-hour lessons. So you have 2 hours to cover all this material. And you're going to see there's a lot of material that we're going to try to cover in some of these different sessions. The next one we call abuse and battering, and we define what abuse and battering is. I did that for you last session. And the first area is denial in male gender training. What is that? In our society, we train men in certain ways, and particularly people that haven't had fathers. High percentage of people that are domestic violence perpetrators were abandoned by their fathers, so they didn't have a good model. And here are some of the different things. Think of this in the area of male gender training. Sense of right for justice, to right wrongs, and to punish. That men have a right and they're supposed to do that. A sense of duty. Ability to objectify. Men, much better than women, can see things as objects. Think of wars. You know, we have Japs, don't we? Now we have Pakis. A sense of disconnection. Goal directiveness. Ideology more important than people. In other words, this is what's right, so this is what I have a right to do, this is what I'm going to do. Might equals right. If you're a kid, who wins? The strongest. And a macho image training, especially for those that are fatherless. What's the picture? It's a very confusing picture for men, because on one hand, we're supposed to be father knows best, right? have the right things, be gentle, be kind, and all those kind of stuff. But if someone ever comes to a member after our family, we're supposed to take them out. And if you're in a war, what are you supposed to do? Be nice to your enemies? So there's a whole confusion here that men have that you've got to sort of try and straighten out their way of thinking. Probably the next one is the most important one that you're going to learn in this session. So I want you to really listen up. These are the characteristics of the classical domestic violence perpetrator. Because these are the issues that are really underlying this and the problems we're really dealing with. First, excessive need for control. Remember what we said about control before? The more you try to control people, the more out of control they get. And the more you try to control your circumstances, the more you overreact and you create your own problems. And that's what's underlying this whole thing. Isolation from society. Why? Because they don't trust anybody. Lack of assertiveness skills. They don't know how to use boundaries effectively and how to deal with issues in their life. They have one solution: punch them out. Well-developed facade. They look good. Most of the people I've dealt with in domestic violence, people are shocked when they get arrested. Because at work, they're wonderful. They'd be the nicest guy. They'd never cross you. They never raise their voice. And all of this, they have no idea what's going on at home. Repressed feelings. They're not in touch with their feelings. The only feeling they know is anger. Hatred of women. Many times they've been brought up in a situation where they felt taken advantage of women and they're afraid. You ever hear the saying, give a woman an inch, she'll take a mile? Well, they're going to make sure this woman never takes an inch. Not even a millimeter, right? Because that would be the defensive thing to do. Under or over dependable. It's interesting, it can be either they're totally irresponsible, or it can be the other end that they're very responsible. They go to their job, they take care of their family, but they control everything. Irrational beliefs. See, they see hurts to their emotions like physical hurts. And it's their right to defend themselves, isn't it? She made me do it. If she didn't say that, I wouldn't have hit her. Overstimulation and chaos. Because they're trying to control things, what happens to their life? It's totally out of control. It's a total mess. And overstimulation, because their entire life probably has been abuse and conflicts and anger and controlling and all of these kind of things. They don't know what it is to be calm. In fact, in some cases, when things get too calm, they'll stir them up. Alienation. It means they feel everybody is against them. There's no one they can really trust. There's no one on their side, including you, the counselor. Are you the one who's leading this group? Fear of abandonment is huge. What are they really afraid of? Inside of themselves, that they're not adequate, that they're not good enough, that they're not going to measure up, and they can't imagine why their wife would even want to stay with them, especially the way they treat her. So what are they sure of? Some other guy's going to walk by and treat her better or something, or some other guy's going to be out there and she's going to be gone. And the only hope is to convince her that she's absolutely worthless, that she can't possibly make it on her own, that she needs to be there totally taken care of, and he's the only guy that's going to do it. Obsessiveness. Obsession is a reaction in your mind where you try to control fear. So the more fear they have, the more they obsess, which means their mind is constantly obsessing, primarily in jealousy. They're sure their wife is having an affair with every single guy at work. They're sure their wife is doing all sorts of things. And their mind is constantly thinking that way, so they're constantly accusing. Inability to handle criticism. They feel so inadequate that you criticize them, you better watch out. Violence is a lifestyle. Likelihood, if you ask, they're going to have other situations where they either threaten people or where they've been in fights and other things, or they were brought up in a domestically violent family of some sort. How about the women? That's the men. How about the women? Before they press charges, the average woman has been attacked 35 times. They have low self-esteem, unrealistic hope that he'll change. They're isolated because he's isolated them. Can't have any friends, can't work, etc., etc., etc. Emotional and economic dependency. Strong traditional view of marriage, and they're codependent. In fact, let me make a statement. Codependency underlies both the perpetrator and the victim. And if you make a list of the characteristics of codependency and the victim and the perpetrator, which is again available in Amend, you'll see that the entire list is exactly the same for all three of them, except for a few on the bottom. So this is really an extreme reaction to codependency. What's the effect of battering? Well, if you've been hit a few times, do you think you have a little bit of fear of being hurt again? Do you think you might develop a few defenses? Do you think there might be a few problems that you have? What do you think life's like? How about walking on eggshells? How about trying to keep from making him mad? How about questioning whether you're sane or not? Because they'll tell you you're not. It's a whole pattern of just being destroyed as a human being until you can hardly function. But another thing that's interesting here is that when you're in a traumatic situation, you actually get connected to the person you're in that situation with. It's called a betrayal bond. And so people like this many times will be battered and they'll go right back to the same guy over and over and over again. It's all part of the things you're going to have to work on when you're doing this. Lesson 3. Achieving nonviolence. We need to work on several things. In the workbook, it gives a continuum of controlling behaviors. In other words, you can control a little bit just by a few words, all the way to being extremely violent. And in between, there's a lot of different steps. And it tends to move in that direction. We have another thing, and it's called the cycle of violence, or the tension rage cycle. When we talked about that some, when we talked about anger, well, here's where it is really powerful. Basically what happens is that the guy is stressed in life. He doesn't know how to deal with his anger, and so his stress and his tension builds until there's a big explosion. Then he says, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I'll never do it again. And he acts real nice as his tension begins to build up again and again and again to have another explosion after explosion after explosion after explosion. And this has to do with a lie. The lie is, I'm supposed to be in control. See, the more he tries to control, the more tension rises, and the more he's out of control, and eventually that becomes a frustration level, stuff the pressure cooker, and the pressure cooker explodes. The other thing we cover in this lesson is understanding jealousy and obsession, because this is a big critical issue. Remember something about anger management? What determined how much anger you got? How you looked at the situation, right? So guess what happens if your mind is constantly obsessing the very worst things that could be happening and the worst fears you can be imagining? How much anger are you going to have? In other words, this person knows how to end anger very well and to blow molehills or misinterpret things to such a degree that they're huge things that are going on. So we talk about rational jealousy, irrational jealousy, obsession, and dehumanization. That's when you call people, you try and act like they're not a human, because then that gives you a right to treat them as inhuman. Lesson 4, exploring and defeating intimidation. Because a lot of this, see, you don't always get the violence. Because the wife is so scared and so intimidated that she's being totally controlled just by the thought that he might get violent. In the workbook, you have a worksheet in timeout versus walks away. And I was teaching them how to do that. And of course, what I put in here is the anger blocks that we taught you earlier in this class, where we're dealing with understanding anger. Remember the anger elevator, the grease slide, and all of that kind of stuff? That's where this all fits, because we're going to have to teach them what? They usually believe that anger is wrong. In fact, some of you are going to find it very interesting. The actual perpetrator usually puts up with too much. They stuff and stuff and stuff and stuff, and then they blow up. And of course, we want to teach them that anger is a gift from God, and we want to teach them to use it appropriately and tell them what things not to do and what things to do. We also recommend an anger journal and anger analysis that we've already taught you to try and figure out what's going on in anger in their life. Then lesson 5, creating a trusting relationship. This is what we try and deal with the family of origin issues. Understanding codependency. This is where all your codependency stuff comes in, because they're all very codependent. Identifying feelings, because most of the time they can't identify their feelings. They don't know what they feel. And finally, social isolation. There's a lot of material on all of this in Changes the Third Path. And we want them to realize that God wants to rely on Him and others and not be isolated. Because remember, the more you're isolated, the more everything depends on one person, the more what they do becomes something you want to control. Then lesson 6, giving and receiving respect. Through nonverbals and actions, they even deal with, in the workbook, with the emotional bank account. A lot of this stuff, if you take in our course on marriage and family, you already know a lot of this, but you notice what we're doing. We're integrating marriage and family concepts in here. Why? They don't know what a healthy family looks like, and they don't know how to have one. If they don't have the skills, are they going to be able to do it? And here's where we hit control. Because control is critical to this entire thing. If we can get them to yield control, and we explain to them, real respect for another person is when you let them make their own decisions and learn from their own consequences, and you don't try to control him. And by the way, here's a good place for an altar call. If you want to put an altar call in here, because what are they trying to be? This is the epitome of trying to be your own God and take care of yourself and rely on no one else. It's just you. So we talk of areas of control. You can control by being passive aggressive, by being aggressive. You need win-loses. And the only things I can control are my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviors. And we talk about equality. That equality wheel that Duluth model uses basically just says you need equal relationships if they're going to be long-lasting. What you're doing is destroying the relationships for the short term instead of for the long term. Lesson 7, accountability, taking responsibility for yourself. I'm responsible for my thoughts, actions, and feelings. Facing the excuses. What are we doing here? Breaking down denial. You're saying, this far into the lesson, 7? Yeah, because they're probably in denial for a lot of the stuff that's going on. And of course, that's why all domestic violence work is done in groups. Because they learn from the other people in the groups, and they can see it a lot better in the other people than they can in an individual session. And it's harder to be in denial when the other people have gone through it and they laugh at you. Otherwise, they're going to spend their time just trying to convince you and pull the wool over your eyes and look good to you, and you're not going to get into these real issues that we're talking about here. Internal and external accountability, minimization, and the facade. We try to help them break down their facade to understand they built this nice way they look to people on the outside because they're so insecure on the inside. It's again one of their major defenses. Lesson 8, maintaining positive sexual relationships. This is primarily in the workbook, but how many domestic violence perpetrators do you think also have problems in the area of sexuality? The majority of them do. Same thing for alcoholics and drug addicts. The majority of them have a problem here. And of course, we're talking about sexual respect, maintaining positive sexual relationships, rape, because that's violence, forcing your wife, that's violence. They even suggest in the workbook that it's their job, instead of doing those kind of things, to be protecting the women in their life from those kind of things. And then they even go into exploring intimacy. They do it a little bit differently in the workbook than we have done it in the past. But they still break up the 5 different areas of intimacy and try and help them understand what it is. How much intimacy do you think a domestic violence perpetrator has or has experienced? Almost nothing. Because to be intimate, you have to know and be known as you really are. How open are they to society? How open are they to admit their wrongs, to admit their problems? They're not at all. There's some of the most closed people that exist in our society. And then pornography, because that's objectification and disrespect for women. If you married this particular woman, do you need to be looking at other women? You're looking at other women's bodies? What does that say? You're probably not satisfied. But anyway, that's a big area also. Then lesson 9, negotiating a partnership. This is where we go into the whole boundaries thing. Like we taught you boundaries earlier in this class, you can take that entire thing, drop it right in here, and help them to understand how to apply boundaries in these different areas of their lives. And then communication. What we actually deal with, most of them don't even understand gender differences between men and women. So we go into a whole deal here trying to help them understand gender difference. It's probably one of the most popular sessions in this entire program. Because when they start saying, oh, that's why she acts the way she does. I thought she was crazy. Because usually they haven't had anything healthy and don't see what it really is like, and learn about relationships. And of course we talk about codependency in that too. Then we have cooperation. This is lesson 10. Cooperating through good communication. Now we talk about communication differences. And all this stuff, if you want more on it, go to our class on marriage and family. Sometimes if we have the time, we'll teach the speaker-listener technique. That's reflective listening, how to really hear somebody. And then we talk about being assertive. Why a person is not assertive? Because they're usually afraid to open up and they don't know how to use boundaries effectively. And even talk about problem-solving skills. A lot of these guys don't even have problem-solving skills. Let me comment on that. Sometimes you have women in these groups. What do you think the percentages are? About 80% are men, 20% are women, and usually, since most of these programs are set for men, you have to help the women learn how they relate in this particular thing. Lesson 11, parenting. Why are we doing that? Why does the workbook even have that? Because how do you think if the wives are being treated this way, how do you think the kids are being treated? Most of the time, they're being overly controlled with anger and threats. Talk about the domestic violence, impacted domestic violence on parents and parenting styles. We talk about family rules, love and logic, other ways of doing parenting, encouragement and discouragement, punishment versus discipline. And then a section, this comes again out of the Changes the Third Path, how to help your children. Warning, they will be like you. They're the source of much of the conflict. They truly are afraid. Most of the time, the perpetrator doesn't really think the other people are afraid of them, because they said, if they're really afraid of me, then she wouldn't backmouth me. Or then the kid would do what I tell him. They don't really understand, so you try and help them to see the other side of this thing. And you help them realize what they can do to really help their kids to overcome these things. And of course, one of the warnings is what? The way you treat them is the way they're going to treat you when they're teenagers. Lesson 12. This comes directly out of the workbook, the first part of it, and it deals with religion and domestic violence. There's a lot of good Bible verses in it, and gives you the entire picture. And then this is a place again for an altar call. Where are you at this point? We're already at lesson 12. Are you saved? Are you still your own God? Have you made Jesus Lord? Because again, if they're going to still be their own God, are they going to actually succeed in this? No, they're going to still be controlling. But if they finally yield up their rights and they start trusting God, that's where we're going to see things totally change. And then in lesson 13, I call it recovery. What we're talking about there is we help them understand the stages that a person goes through going through this process. Because it isn't just we're giving them all this information. We're discussing this stuff. We're discussing their individual issues, the individual stuff that's going on in their lives, and we're helping them to become more functionable in life. But here are the stages according to Amen. Stage 1, establishing accountability. Phase 1, crisis intervention and commitment to therapy, and breaking down denial. Until you've brought down denial, you're not even into stage 1 yet. Because until they admit where they are, they're not going to change. Stage 2, denial begins to break down, and only in stage 3 do we start getting emotional recovery. Stability or attempting to give up that stimulation. They talk about being in the tunnel. You know, as you go into this tunnel, you don't know what's going on, your life's a disaster, it's all black, you don't see anything. And about in the middle of the tunnel, when you can't see in back of you and you can't see forward anymore, you might panic, you might check out, you might quit. But if you'll keep going, you'll eventually see the light at the end of the tunnel. You'll start seeing how to have a new life. You'll start seeing how all these things can help you and you can be functional about. And then in the phase 2 of stage 3 is the therapeutic intervention. That's when the group is really starting to work and people are really starting to change. And see, in the groups, what's really interesting is, initially, you might have problems. Now, we run continuous groups. What does that do for us? People can jump into this at any particular point. They just go through the 13 steps. But what it buys you is you have some people that are very along in their recovery. And they can help confront and deal with the new people coming in the beginning. So we always have a mix of fairly recovered people and people who are just starting. Some of these groups are done just straight out where you start this week and you end this week. I don't recommend that as much because you don't have that mix and now you're the one that's struggling and they may even collude against you. And then the last part of step 13 is the faith walk. If they've been saved, we want to help them to learn how to be a Christian, to walk in that way. And actually in our groups, we have people for requested additional classes and counseling after they finish the program. Many times in parenting, many times in marriage and family, or individual counseling, because they realize by now all the issues that they never knew about and the mess that they've made of their lives, and they really want to see some change. So it can be very, very effective that way. Here are just a few critical things, though, that if you're dealing with a group like this, and we'll end with this. Never remove hope that the goal is achievable. Because in the middle of that tunnel, what do they think? I can never change. This is never going to happen. I can never have a healthy family. Help them to function in society and the job so they're making progression as you're going through the group. So they're seeing things are starting to get better when they're learning boundaries, when they're learning these different things, they're being applied and they're starting to get better. Teach techniques. And I mentioned a lot of techniques to teach here, different things they can start applying so they can make progress. Biggie, confront homicidal threats directly. You might have people in the group that's saying, I'm going to take her out and I'm going to skin her alive and beat her to a pulp. Well, you now better stop the group and deal with that directly and confront the person. And of course, if they are homicidal, you have a duty to warn. And you have a duty to call the police and lock them up. So that means some very serious stuff that can go on in groups like this. What's interesting to me, a lot of these groups are led by ladies. Establish that violence and abuse are wrong and set clear limits. Be available in a crisis. Now, when do you not use groups like that? Who do you not want to have in your group? First, if they're intravenous drug users and they're still in their drugs. No connection to the community. Transients. because there's no place for them to work this out. They're just there. You want to get them established in the community because we're trying to really help them. Psychotics, if they basically are living in unreality, because who knows what they might do. They need to have that taken care of first. And finally, if they need detoxification for drugs and alcohol. Now that's a pretty big thing, and we covered a lot of material. And what we do, of course, is we have our list and we sort of modify as we go along based on the needs of that particular group and the needs of the individuals in the group. I have a theory, and this is my counseling theory all the time. The theory is, put the fires out in the house before you build a porch. The idea is what? If you have critical things and they're about ready to blow up or things are going to happen to those people, you're going to deal with those people and focus in on that in the session. You're still going to try and get your material in, but the material isn't the most critical thing. It's helping them make it day to day, and hour to hour, without ending up in jail, without an overall disaster. And you might not think this stuff is powerful, but it's very, very powerful. Remember one particular guy that he was stalking his wife. Finally, the judge said to him, "What is it that you do not understand about restraining orders?" Well, after about the 5th or 6th time he did this, we never saw him in the group again. Because see, what is going on outside of the group can terminate what you're actually accomplishing in the group. If you want to take it on, it's a huge area, but you have to care for people. You have to care for that scared little boy inside of that big suit of armor, because that's what you're dealing with, is a very insecure, scared person, and all they're doing are their ways that they have learned to cope with life, and of course, they don't work. Let's pray. Lord, we ask that you would give us wisdom. And Lord, in situations like this, you would help us to do what's best, first for the victim, the way of escape, the way to protect them, but then for the perpetrator, and that we could really care and see through all that armor and all those excuses and all that denial and really get to the core of the issue and help them to get to know you in a real way, that they might be transformed in Jesus' name. Amen.
Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer